Hey everybody, it's Chase with AV Pop Culture again, and today we are going to talk about how movies like these helped influence and make possible even more movies like these. Pop that tape in. I got you. Let's go do this. All right, so we have a interesting topic here today: exploitation films, specifically mostly sexploitation films, and how those influenced and affected the horror movies that we know and love, particularly from the late 70s and early 80s on into the 90s, and in case of this movie right here, into the 2000s. We had, and even beyond, in others too, not just this one. Recently, I picked up a couple of movies with the intention of talking about this because, as someone who is sort of a film historian, not just a movie fan, not just a filmmaker, I'm interested in like how cinema and how film has developed over time. And when you talk about horror itself is a form of exploitation film. You're exploiting sex, nudity, violence, fear. I mean, in some ways, every movie is exploitive because you're going after you're exploiting something to get a reaction, and to get people into the theaters. So you could say, well, if they're all type of exploitive or exploitative films, then what's the difference? Well, the reason we probably tend to see more in horror kind of goes back to before horror movies were as big, like at least horror movies as we know it in the late 70s, 80s, and the 90s. I mean, you had like Hammer horror, which had sexual. I mean, there was the sexual component there. I mean, vampires, like by nature, kind of have that, but you think about the classic Universal monsters, and there's actually a layer of stuff under there. But like as far as being in your face is what I'm talking about. So I really think that comes in more with like the late 70s, mid 70s, late 70s into the 80s, especially the 80s capitalized on sexploitation in a huge, huge way. And you have movies like Dracula Sucks, which it does. It really does. I mean, it's basically, a semi like kind of soft to hardcore, like, porn film, basically. And the same with Sex World, although it's disguised as a sci-fi film. But those movies definitely had an influence because at some point you had this rise in films like that and pornography theaters and everything. And then as a reaction to that, you got the, what's called like the decency laws, which is basically like the moral police laws, like, obscenity laws and standards and things like that kind of put the kibosh on those movies in their popularity in a way, because it just made them harder to access. And like, I'm by no means an expert on all of this, but you can see how it starts to go in, because now, instead of films like that, now we still want to exploit this for just the natural human condition of wanting to see the sex with the violence and things like that, and them kind of go hand in hand because they have a visceral reaction. We still want to exploit that to get butts in the seats, to get money, and to tell the stories we want to tell. And that's where sexploitation films and even like porn films to an extent influenced the rise of the late 70s, 80s horror, because it is very difficult to find an 80s horror film that doesn't have sex in it. Even if you go back to like Halloween, I mean, you have PJ Souls, they're sex. I mean, they're all the girls, all except for Laurie Strode, are down on Halloween night. They're trying to, get with their boyfriends and hang out and everything else. And there's the famous scene with PJ Souls, and she sets up and the sheet comes off of her and, see anything you like kind of thing. I mean, that's totally exploitation and it's totally sexploitation. That's what it is. I mean, it's a real human condition and it reflects something that could really happen for sure. And stuff that, teenagers, seniors in high school, particularly and stuff, it's nothing that's going to make them blush because it's nothing that hasn't crossed their mind. So you're exploiting that on screen as part of your story to help tell your story and get more people to tell your story. And they go hand in hand. And then you kind of continue on. And I mean, look at the basis of Friday the 13th. They, the camp counselors are having sex and doing drugs and partying or drinking or partying and having sex mostly and not paying attention. And Jason, drowns or whatever. And his mom's pissed about it. So out of the sexploitation cinema and the porn stuff that moved in, that kind of migrated its way into horror movies, to kind of be a reaction to the decency or obscenity laws, things like that, and to still get this in at some point in there, it was that stuff became used as a morality tale. So like it was, the sex is bad, the partying is bad. And usually what happens to bad people that shirk their responsibilities and give in to primal urges of sex and partying and things like that, something bad happens to them. The killer's going to get them. And that's sort of because that comes from a generation that was like, oh, this is taboo. This is taboo. Where the generation, like where, before it was like, ooh, there's these sexploitation films and it's popular and everything else. And don't get me wrong, that stuff has probably never quit being popular. In some ways, it just changes forms and everything, but it has always found its way. It's not just horror movies, though. It's more prevalent in horror movies because it's like the sex and the violence, the sex and the danger, the not paying attention. A lot of times it's used as a way to kind of get away with the people being so stupid in the movies that the killers can get, the killer or the monster can get them because they are very preoccupied with their primal urges of sex and partying and things like that. They're very preoccupied with that. So they don't really pay attention to the things they're supposed to pay attention to, and they shirk their responsibilities and they're doing bad. So guess what? Now they must be punished. And that is definitely a recurring theme that pops up in horror, and it comes from sexploitation films. And you can kind of see that in those grindhousey type films. Rob Zombie is somebody that has brought that back, like in the the 2000s. He really pushes that kind of exploitation film angle in his stuff. But it was sort of just ingrained. Like when you look at even A Nightmare on Elm Street, like the big scene that everybody remembers where she's getting ripped apart and goes up the ceiling and everything else, they just had sex, and he's sitting there watching her be ripped apart and, have sex, you die. And, but that's still the sex component, even though it morphed into like a morality tale that came out of having it ingrained that, with the obscenity laws and the decency, like you can't do this. So like, okay, they don't want us to do this. It still makes a lot of money. We still need to exploit it. People still have these urges. So we're going to put it into these films And in order to sneak it by everybody, we're going to put it into a overall narrative where it makes sense, because it makes sense a lot of times. We're going to put it into an overall narrative where it makes sense, and then we're going to use it as a morality tale, but we're still going to have it in there. And we can say, hey, yeah, there's a lot of sex and nudity in here, but it's put in here as a way to show what happens when you give into that, and it's a bad, it's a punishment if you give into that, and usually you die. So you got the camp counselors again in Friday the 13th, partying up, they're going to die. That is a recurring theme in every Friday the 13th movie. Sex, nudity, and then guess what? You're going to die. And that's a way to bring that sexploitation in, make it palatable to anyone on the outside that wants to put the reins on it. Now you've made it palatable because you've portrayed it in a bad light, and now it's in there. So you have adolescent boys, you have people in general with their urges and everything else, and they want to see it, and the sex and the violence stimulates similar parts of the brain. So it's all there, and it all goes hand in hand, and it just works. And it's quite possible without movies like, these, and I'm just using these as an example, but like sexploitation films and stuff like that, and then the reaction to those, we may not have as much of that in horror movies as we did. Now, I do think that it would always in some way have found its way in, because it kind of goes hand in hand with the whole like sin, quote unquote, and get killed. You would have to have more kind of, it's very easy. So, okay, it's very easy to write a sex scene. People are wrapped up in themselves and they're not paying attention. Because how many times you watch a horror movie and you'd be like, what are you doing? I wouldn't do that. Or, oh my God, pay attention. He's right over there. Well, you can say, well, of course they're not paying attention. They're having sex, or they're naked in front of each other. So that's what they're concentrating on. They're not concentrating on the monster or whoever coming to get them. So you would always need that device to help suspend reality and keep people's eyes focused right here. Because that's the other thing. If I have two beautiful, actor and actress on screen, and they're doing a sex scene, and they're nude or whatever else, you're focused on them, and pulling that focus on them helps elevate the scare, because even if you know it's coming, you can't help but get focused on what they're doing. You're trying to concentrate because Jason's coming. He's coming any minute. He's going to get in there with his machete. He's going to get in there, but you're still focused on them. So it is a great device. People can say, oh, it's gratuitous. Of course it's gratuitous. That's the point. All a horror movie is gratuitous. Horror movies in general are gratuitous. Most movies are gratuitous with something in some way. It could be sappy, emotional, heartstring pulling. It's like just over the top melodrama. And it can be gratuitous. Like, oh my God, this is so sappy. It could definitely be there. It could be gratuitous action or violence, like whatever. All movies are gratuitous in some way. I have a movie right here behind me, Realm of Souls, that I think it was Dread Central or somebody reviewed, and it's on the cover. It says, gratuitous and gritty. And I'm like, great, you paid attention to it. But at the same time, the sexploitation aspect of this has a monetary value to it, especially like with lower budget films. For instance, with that same movie, I had a deal with a distributor to put that film out, and they came back and said, hey, movie doesn't really have any sex or nudity in it. Doesn't have very much of anything like that. We need you to shoot an additional opening for this movie, a stinger, kind of, if you will, that sets up this whole place and the things that are happening there. And can you add sex and nudity into it with the kills? Because it will help us sell this overseas, because all the time. Plot and language and everything doesn't necessarily, like dialogue, plot necessarily may not always translate into different languages, but the visceral stuff, the scares, the violence, the kills, the nudity, the sex, the fear, that translates into any language. And not everybody has the same standards of what they consider gratuitous versus not gratuitous. So I actually had to go back after the fact to finish this distribution deal and shoot an extra scene, an opening to that film that definitely has some of that in there in order to finish the deal. And that was part of the deal to get it out on physical media, which was very important to me. And it wasn't it wasn't like my opus of a movie anyway. So it's like a mixed found footage type style film. So I was like, okay, it was only like my second film. I'm like, I got to get this out there. And it's one of those things that is just prevalent, and it always has been until like we hit this. You also have to remember, first of all, I don't script anything. Nothing you ever see me talk about on here is scripted. I have an idea of what I talk about. I get in here and talk from my knowledge. So sometimes I might jump around a little because I don't script anything. I write enough scripts and stuff. There is nothing I script ever. So sometimes I might jump tracks and train of thought, but be with me. I'll get back on it. So when you go into these exploitation type films, and like I said, all of horror is an exploitation of some kind. You have to understand that it is something that has kind of always been kind of sneaking in there to that. And then we didn't have PG-13 like in the 70s until like the mid 80s. Like there's an argument over which movie started the PG-13. Like Red Dawn is one of those that is kind of like given that title, but I think there's a couple of other films too. People argue which one got PG-13 rating first. But it was either PG or R. So it was like, okay, we're either all the way over here a family film, or we might as well go for R. So that's why almost every horror movie in the 70s, 80s was rated R. I mean, because there's no way it was getting a PG rating. And so that's, I think it's like 16 Candles actually has a scene at the beginning of it where they're watching the girl in the shower and she's completely nude, but that movie has a PG rating because that's like the only thing it has. Right now, that would immediately made it PG-13 or more, so it wouldn't be in there. Just the kind of interesting thing with the ratings. And then I think what happened at some point with the PG-13 rating is studios started saying, hey, what if we soften the horror a little bit and we take some of this exploitation out of it? We take some of the nudity, the sex, a lot of, the violence. We tone down the blood, everything else. And let's go PG-13, and then we can get way more asses in the seats in the theater, and we can sell a lot more copies because it doesn't take 14-year-olds convincing their parents to take them to a movie anymore. We're like, when we were a kid, it's like, oh, please, can we rent this? Can we go see this? Please. You didn't have to do that if you could cut it down. And in some cases, no way around it, water it down to make it PG-13. Now there's some fine PG-13 horror movies. I think, but I think a lot of what happens is, when you kind of took that exploitation angle out of it, you kind of started to create a movie that wasn't maybe always intense enough for the adult horror crowd, especially the ones that were raised on 70s and 80s and early 90s horror. But you still maybe had something that was too intense for like the average 13-year-old who didn't grow up with the other stuff. So you kind of ended up with something that maybe didn't please either audience. And then you kind of think about that and you're like, know who your target is. and go for your target instead of just worrying about what you sell. And then you have this problem of, well, now we're not selling as many movie tickets. People are watching other things because now guess what too? They can stream anything they want to at home. Even before streaming got big, when you got Netflix, you know, if your parents had a Netflix account and you're these 13, 14-year-old kids, you could watch anything you wanted to. So you didn't have to run out to watch a PG-13 horror movie. My son, for instance, is 13. Now, he's grew up around me making horror movies and stuff, so it's a little bit different. But he's a big Five Nights at Freddy's fan. And he's like, the movie's okay. It's kind of a letdown compared to the very scary, I guess apparently the more scary and violent video game. He's like, I was expecting it to be more intense. He actually way prefers Willy's Wonderland. They actually and my daughter, they prefer Willy's Wonderland, even though they're big Five Nights at Freddy's fans. And it's like, well, did they just water that down? Is it not as violent? He's like, yeah, the video game is scarier and more violent. I don't know. I haven't really I've sat in there and played a little bit of the video game with him. I make horror movies, so none of it, I'm kind of desensitized to it a little bit myself. I'll talk to you more about the type of movies that actually scare me. But, you know, so I feel like you water it down. You take that exploitation element out of it, and you can run the risk of missing both of your audiences and ending up with something that's just kind of, meh, it was okay. But not something that becomes so ingrained that people 40 years later are still like hustling to buy it and buy every new version of it, like Halloween or Nightmare on Elm Street or Friday the 13th, things like that they are rushing to buy again and again and again in every form because it left such a mark. I'm not sure that you're going to have that same kind of feeling for a lot of these other movies, because there is nothing like so in your face and exploitative about, probably saying that word wrong. I'm a writer, but that's bad. There's nothing like in your face, and the exploitation isn't there to kind of like, remember, oh, that was badass. The girl, like, you know, she's out there skinny dipping. The girl and the guy are out there skinny dipping, and then they get killed. There comes Jason to get them. And you remember that kill and stuff like that. That kill where the arrow came through his throat and stuff like that you won't get with PG-13 when you take away that exploitation angle, the sex, the violence, exploitation angle of it. You won't get it. I mean, I think there's kind of like a Friday the 13th parodies itself a little bit about this in one of the films. And you're going to kill me, but I can't remember which one it is, where it starts off and it's the FBI agent and she's like showering in the house alone and making a big deal out of it because she's bait for Jason. Basically, she's bait. They're luring him in. Is that new? I can't remember which one. Tell me which one it is. I can't remember off the top of my head. Like I said, I don't script. But it's like, okay, that the bait for Jason is, you know, this helpless girl, you know, she's a badass. This helpless girl alone, you know, undressing and showering. Even in Freddy vs. Jason, you go into Jason's dreams, he's dreaming about killing, you know, counselors that are not paying attention and having sex and stuff like that. So it's kind of, you self-aware of it, and it's things that help you remember, like these massive kills or like these sexual undertones to things like Videodrome and like all types of movies, even like Paul Verhoeven's sci-fi movies. And I'm going to get into Verhoeven in a whole video here soon. But all of this stuff, even the 80s comedies they were called sex comedies. They were sexploitation. And while it was naturally occurring and it made sense, they definitely made use of it in order to sell the narrative and to help sell the narrative and tell the narrative and put asses in the seats and sell the movie. And, you know, to me, I could get flamed for this. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. Like, if you're an adult, you know, or you're a parent and you decide my kids can watch this or I'm going to watch this, I don't need anybody to pre-censor for me. Make the movie, tell the story the way you want to tell it, with whoever you want to tell it with, and then I will decide if it's appropriate or I want to see it. That's how it should be. It shouldn't be we need to make the movie checking these boxes like, well, we need to make sure this isn't in here, that might offend somebody, or this isn't in here, that'll get us an R rating, or this isn't here for whatever reason. I don't need that kind of you making the decision for me. Make the awesome film the best that you can, and then I will decide whether I want to see it or not. I don't want to see your like pre-censored version that you think is going to check all the boxes that I want to see. Just tell the damn story. Make the movie, and I want to be offended. Show me something, because at least then I'm feeling something from the movie. If you offend me, or if I think, God, that is gross, I can't watch, I'm never watching that again. You gave me a visceral reaction to a piece of art, to a film. And that's the biggest compliment that you can give. It's not just to kiss ass and be, oh, it was such a great film. No, it made me feel something, one way or the other. I had Bill Moseley was in one of my films. Now, if you guys don't know Bill, maybe Bill is Chop Top in Texas Chainsaw 2. Bill is in House of a Thousand Corpses and stuff. He's Otis Driftwood. He's been in tons of horror movies. He was in my movie Dark Roads, and we had a talk on set because there's a scene in 3 from Hell. I believe it's 3 from Hell, where they're in there's this like Christian singing group or band or family or whatever that's in the hotel, and I mean, they got him there in gunpoint in there, it's gruesome, and it is so sick and twisted what they're making them do, how they're treating them, and everything else. And I asked Bill, I was like, because it genuinely disturbs me, and Bill is the nicest guy that you can ever meet. And by the way, get well, Bill. He just got a hit. He got hit by a cyclist, a hit and run, and fractured his pelvis and broke his ribs. But he is like the nicest guy that you could ever meet. And he just like, we filmed up in at these beautiful cabins in North Georgia. And after he filmed his days filming, he hung out for a few days, and we cooked out there on set one night, and we're talking, and I'm asking him about that scene, and he's like, I had a hard time with it too. And he talked to Rob Zombie, and he's like, and this has stuck with me too. He's like, Bill, it's art, and art isn't safe. And that's how it should be. There are plenty of other places in life where you rein it in and all that kind of stuff, but art isn't safe. And if you set out to make safe art and you set out to make safe films, you're going to fail most of the time. And that's what's happening right now a lot in the theaters and stuff like that with the movies that are flopping. They set out to make something that is safe. And when you set out to do that versus set out to tell a story that elicits a reaction, that makes people remember it, that makes people talk about it, when you do those things, then you have a recipe for success. When you set out to just be safe and say, okay, we don't want to have an R rating, or we don't want to offend this person, or we don't want to do this, or we don't want to do that. I don't care what it is or what side you're on. If you set out to do all those things first, before you set out to tell a story that will, and make a movie that will blow people's minds and make them feel happy, sad, excited, scared, repulsed, whatever, that should be your goal. And when that becomes the goal again, then things will improve with movies. There's a reason why they don't know what to do now, and they're going back and they keep trying to remake 80s and 70s stuff, but they're trying to make it with today's safe lines, and it's not going to work. What made those things so successful is they didn't give a shit. They colored outside the lines. They were going to tell you a story that would rock your world one way or the other. It was going to make you feel something. And now it's just about, okay, well, we checked all these boxes and we've got a good rating, and this should make X amount of dollars, hopefully, and everything else. And it's totally forgettable. It is totally forgettable. And people aren't rushing out to see it. Because why? Because it's like everything else that you make, and you're gonna rip the cord off of it, and it's gonna be on home video or video on demand digital in a week. So who gives a shit? It's gonna be like everything else that you put out. Whereas when you put out Halloween, I mean, John Carpenter talks about how he watched people in the theater not cover their eyes, but cover their ears, because the sound, that dun, 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 that sound, the music that he created, the off-time music that went with the pictures, it made people feel something. It made them anxious, scared, on the edge of their seat, and to the point where they couldn't take it. And they could watch, but they couldn't listen, because that was stirring them up so much, and then they never forgot it. And 45 years later or whatever, we're still buying 4K sets of it and paying exorbitant amounts because it is awesome. It's fucking awesome. And it will still be awesome another 40 years from now because it sets a standard. The same way Nightmare on Elm Street set a standard. The same way that Friday the 13th set a standard. And these movies set a standard. And now we're worried about it. This movie right here, the 2009, is it 2009? I think this, and a lot of people don't like this. And I talked to Derek Mears at one of the conventions I spoke at. It was like Days of the Dead LA, and awesome dude. And I actually, there are things I don't like about this movie. I feel like they try to take away the supernatural element from Jason, which is the same thing Rob Zombie did in his Halloween movies. And even though Tyler Mane, who played Michael Myers, he also did one of my movies, I'm not the biggest fan of Zombie's Halloween movies because he's a boogeyman. And Jason is supernatural being, period. The end. When you start trying to go and have conventional explanations, I don't like it. But what this film did do is it did not in any way, shape, or form shy away from the exploitation. I mean, there's one of the longest sex scenes in this movie, sex and nudity scenes in this movie that I have ever seen. I mean, there might be 10 people that get killed in the middle of Travis Van Winkle and I can't remember her name having sex in the room and videotaping it and everything else while people are like, dude, it absolutely gets after it and goes for it. You know, and there's plenty of scenes like that in the movie. So it kind of, in that way, it was a throwback. I just don't like, you know, how did Jason survive all this time if he's not supernatural? He's supernatural. Like, come on. Same with Michael Myers. He's the boogeyman. Give me a break. I don't like when you change that. But it still had that feel to it. So I don't completely hate the movie. There's parts of it I really like. I'm a big Jared Padalecki fan because I like Supernatural. And trying to find somebody bigger than him to make Jason imposing is difficult because I think Padalecki's like 6'5" or 6'6". So it was one of those where it was actually a good fight with Jason at the end. And I really liked that. Like, it was a believable fight. That part I liked. But, you know, it still brought that back. But like since then, I can't really remember anything. And that is kind of that same level. And that's kind of the point. You don't really remember. They just kind of blend together. But I promise you, I remember Friday the 13th. I promise you, I remember Nightmare on Elm Street. I promise you, we all remember Halloween. Like, you do, because it left a mark. It used that exploitation, and it made you feel something that 45 years later, we all still remember. And that's where it's of benefit, and that's how they influence each other. I remember, and I might get cracked on for this, I don't know, because I don't care what people think about what I like. I like what I like, you what you like. That's the whole point. It's what makes movies awesome as hell. I remember being excited when I saw that The Conjuring, the first one, came out and it had an R rating. I'm like, man, an R-rated horror movie. All right, adult R-rated horror. Let's go. Let's rock it. And I will tell you this, and you're going to laugh. This is the kind of movies that scare me, actually. Like monsters, I'm a big dude. I feel like I can fight. I can, I'll be all right. Monsters, like, they don't scare me. What scares me more is like the supernatural type stuff that I identify with too much and feels like it could really happen. And then The Conjuring is rated R based on nothing in the original except for being intense. Like, it's not really exploitive at all, or exploitative. It's driving me nuts. It doesn't really have that exploitation factor at all. I mean, it exploits fear and like violence to an extent, but there's not like a bunch of nudity. There's not even a bunch of bad language or anything in The Conjuring. It's just intense. And it was deemed to be like too intense initially on release for a PG-13 rating. And I actually thought the first movie scared me. Like, me and my friend Lance, who makes movies with me, he's got a new movie that's out now called Flux with Tyrese Gibson, and check that out. But we actually went and saw the movie, and we were in the middle of production on a film and came back to my house. And like, I think me and him were like the only ones in the theater. We went and saw like a midnight screening of it. And we came back to my house, and I mean, we were both like spooked out for a while. We put on, I shit you not, like Sweet Home Alabama in my living room. He slept on one couch and I slept on the other because we were like freaked out. Now, we might have had some cocktails before then too, but we were freaked out. It genuinely freaked me out, and I liked it, man. Like, that's the kind of stuff that I want. I want to be scared. I want to remember something. I want to feel something. And then, the others went for me. But I want to feel something. And I think that's been taken out a little bit, but the foundations of it were there. Let's get back to making stuff that is memorable. And no matter what you got to incorporate in there to do that, tell a damn good story. And let's keep this genre alive in physical media, because that's the kind of stuff people want to collect. They don't want to collect forgettable stuff that they're going to watch one time. They want stuff that's got that fun stuff that they can pop in with their friends and remember and watch and enjoy over and over again, even if it's so bad it's good type thing. But let me know what you think. I mean, it's okay to say I'm crazy and off base, whatever, but let me know in the comments. And I hope you've enjoyed this. And until next time, be kind, rewind like always. This is Chase with AV Pop Culture, and I'll see you again real soon. Bye-bye.